In this section, we're going to look at what are called themes in biology, some of the things that we'll study throughout this year. So first of all, if we look at diversity, which means variety, a lot of times people think of diversity as far as different races of individuals. But if we look at it on a more broad spectrum, we could think about diversity in species or organisms. For example, all of these are birds, but we have a large, diverse mix of kinds of birds. So looking at what's called unity, that would be traits or features that things have in common. So you can look at unity in individual humans. What do they have in common? Simple things like fingers and toes, or even things as far as maybe organs, heart, lungs. But when we're looking at organisms, we all have a genetic code in common that dictates the heredity or the genetic information that organisms have. And we also all have organelles. The tree of life represents that unity and diversity throughout all organisms. So organisms that have more things in common are going to be closer to each other on the tree of life, as opposed to things that have few things in common, they'll be spaced far apart. This is an example of a tree of life, and if you look, things that are more closely related, amphibians and turtles, are close together, versus things that are not so closely related. We've got crocodiles and birds versus way up at the top, bacteria. There are three main categories of life, or three domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Bacteria and archaea are going to be single-celled organisms, where eukarya are going to be multicellular. The three domains are then broken down into kingdoms. These 6 major kingdoms start off with the 2 domains that we looked at, bacteria and archaea, and then branch off into Animalia, Planta, fungi, and Protista. When we look at interdependence of organisms, we're looking at how are things interacting with each other. So ecology, which is the study of how organisms interact with each other and their environment, is a science that you can actually take your senior year. Ecosystems are going to look at how those species, again, interact with each other and also their environments. So if we're looking at fish in a pond, the birds that might come and eat from that pond, other animals and plants that might be around that pond ecosystem. So if we look at this picture, an ecosystem, we've got some fish and we've got some bacteria, frog, bird, dragonfly. The sun actually plays a role in the ecosystem because it's going to help the plants grow. So some things to look at. What would happen if we would remove certain organisms from this environment? If we took away all of the frogs, how would that affect the crane and the otter and the dragonfly population? Evolution is looking at how populations of organisms change over long periods of times, over multiple generations. So if we look at the modern horse and how it might have looked many, many, many years ago, and how that evolved over time. Natural selection looks at organisms that might have favorable traits and how they are better able to survive than other organisms. And if we look at this example here, the birds are only wanting to eat the green bugs. So the yellow or orange bugs have a more favorable trait. So over time, those orange bugs would tend to thrive, and they would be able to reproduce more and populate the area more than the green bugs originally did. So an adaptation is an ability of an organism to change to be able to survive better in an area and also to then be able to reproduce, because the ability to reproduce is going to allow them to keep their generations continuing. So as we look at different things, if we look at Labradors, if breeders only bred for yellow labs, over time we would have a lot less black labs. So that would be an adaptation based solely on human interaction, human consequence. But it also happens in nature, and we'll look at that throughout the year as well.